The room was electric with tension. The invitation-only debate had drawn a packed crowd at a prestigious university, its grand auditorium echoing with murmurs of anticipation. Tonight, it was set to be an ideological clash between two of the most controversial and outspoken figures in modern media: Tucker Carlson, the firebrand conservative commentator, and Joe Rogan, the free-thinking podcast king, against none other than Jackson Hayes, the self-proclaimed voice of the new progressive movement. Jackson was a rising star in woke journalism. His articles, sharp as knives, had taken down politicians, exposed corporate greed, and championed social justice causes with an intensity that left no room for middle ground. He had built his career on dismantling figures like Carlson, labeling them as relics of a dying ideology. But tonight, he had to face them directly, not through edited columns or Twitter storms, but in a battle of wits and words. The debate topic: Free Speech versus Social Responsibility, the Future of Media in America. The audience was a mix of enthusiastic students, skeptical intellectuals, and media personalities eager to witness the clash. Rogan sat in his chair, arms crossed, that familiar smirk playing on his lips. Carlson, suited up, leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze locked onto Jackson like a predator studying its prey. The moderator, an elderly professor with years of debate experience, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, welcome. Tonight's discussion is about the role of media and speech in shaping our culture. Mr. Hayes, as the guest advocating for responsible speech, you may begin." Jackson adjusted his glasses and leaned into the microphone. His voice was measured, confident. "The world has changed," he began, scanning the audience as if rallying his troops. "We are no longer in an era where unchecked speech can exist without consequences. Words have power. Misinformation has consequences. Hate speech radicalizes. The days of treating media as a free-for-all are over. And people like you," he gestured toward Carlson and Rogan, "have profited from spreading dangerous ideas, from normalizing racism, sexism, and misinformation under the guise of open dialogue. That needs to end." The audience erupted, half in applause, half in scoffs. Tucker Carlson chuckled, shaking his head. "Wow. That was an impressive opening monologue, Jackson. But let me ask you something. Who decides what's dangerous?" "You." Jackson smiled, but there was a hint of irritation. "No, Tucker. Society does. That's why we have institutions to regulate hate speech. The majority of reasonable people agree that certain rhetoric, anti-LGBTQ comments, racist dog whistles, climate change denial, shouldn't be given a platform." Joe Rogan finally leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the table. "Okay, so, let's break this down logically. You say, society decides, but what you really mean is a select group of media elites and activists. You don't mean society, as in the millions of Americans who might disagree with you, right?" Jackson's smile tightened. "Joe, come on. We both know the data. People are more educated now. They recognize harmful narratives." Rogan raised an eyebrow. "You mean like how people recognized that questioning the government during COVID was dangerous misinformation, until it turned out that a lot of that so-called misinformation was actually true?" A low murmur rippled through the audience. Jackson's face darkened. "That's a false equivalency," he shot back. "During a crisis, misinformation is deadly. People who spread lies about vaccines, about the pandemic, endangered lives." Tucker leaned in now, his voice sharp as a blade. "And yet, it was the approved sources that got things wrong time and time again. The lab leak theory, labeled a conspiracy until it wasn't. Natural immunity, downplayed. Mask effectiveness, debated, censored, then quietly admitted to be uncertain. Your side doesn't regulate truth, Jackson, it regulates narrative." Applause broke out from Carlson's supporters in the audience. Jackson shifted in his seat. "That's a gross oversimplification. Scientists do their best with evolving data. But let's talk about your narratives, Tucker. You spend every night stoking fear about immigrants, about the left ruining America. You think that doesn't lead to real-world violence? January 6th happened because of rhetoric like yours." Tucker grinned, shaking his head. "And BLM riots happened because of rhetoric like yours. Should we start pulling up the body count of those mostly peaceful protests?" Jackson's face twitched. Rogan saw the opening and went for it. "Here's the thing, man," he said, leaning forward. "You keep saying speech has consequences, and yeah, it does. But shutting down speech has consequences too. When you ban opinions, silence debates, people don't just stop believing them. They go underground, they radicalize. Wouldn't you rather have these discussions out in the open where people can challenge bad ideas?" Jackson's frustration began to show. "That's a cop-out. You're giving platforms to bigots, conspiracy theorists, people who do real harm. And who made you the arbiter of who gets a platform?" Carlson snapped. The crowd roared with energy. The battle lines were drawn. Jackson's voice hardened. "I made my career exposing people like you. You hide behind free speech, while making millions spreading misinformation and fear. People like you," he pointed between Carlson and Rogan, "aren't defenders of free speech. You're profiteers of chaos." Carlson smirked. "Says the guy who built his career off outrage clicks." The moderator had to step in. "Gentlemen, let's stay on topic. Next question, what is the role of media in a free society, and does it have a duty to suppress harmful rhetoric?" Rogan and Carlson exchanged a glance. The real fight was just getting started. The energy in the room was electric. The first round of exchanges had left the audience on edge, some leaning forward in support, others whispering in frustration. But one thing was clear: neither side was backing down. The moderator, sensing the mounting tension, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "The next question is crucial to this discussion. What is the role of media in a free society, and does it have a duty to suppress harmful rhetoric? Mr. Rogan, let's start with you." Joe Rogan, relaxed as ever, leaned back in his chair. "All right. Media's role should be simple. Tell the truth, let people make up their own minds, and don't act like some moral authority trying to protect the public from ideas. People aren't stupid. If you start deciding what ideas are too dangerous for them to hear, you're treating them like children." Jackson scoffed. "That's incredibly naive, Joe. The media isn't just some neutral force. It shapes public perception, influences policy, and affects real lives. If we let anyone with a microphone spread lies or dangerous ideologies, people do get hurt. Hate speech leads to violence. Misinformation leads to deaths." Tucker Carlson chuckled, shaking his head. "You keep saying misinformation like it's some objective term. But let's be honest, what you really mean is any opinion you don't like. Who gets to decide what's harmful? You. The government. Some 23-year-old fact-checker in a newsroom who just graduated with a degree in gender studies." Laughter rippled through the audience. Even Rogan smirked. Jackson, however, wasn't amused. "That's a straw man," Jackson snapped. "We're talking about actual harm. You can't just throw out conspiracy theories, radicalize people, and then hide behind free speech when it leads to real-world violence. Look at January 6th. Look at the Buffalo shooter who was inspired by Great Replacement nonsense. Speech has consequences." Carlson's smirk widened. "And yet, when left-wing violence happens, nobody in the media blames your rhetoric. The guy who tried to assassinate Brett Kavanaugh, did the press ask what MSNBC host radicalized him? The mobs outside conservative justices' homes, was that because of dangerous speech from your side?" Jackson's mouth opened, but Carlson kept going. "Let's get real. When your side incites violence, you call it righteous anger. When our side protests, it's domestic terrorism. The media doesn't regulate harmful speech, it polices speech that threatens its own power." The conservative half of the audience erupted in cheers. Jackson clenched his jaw. Rogan, sensing an opportunity, jumped in. "Look, man, here's the problem. You want to regulate speech based on impact, right? But impact is subjective. You say, hate speech leads to violence. Okay, well, what about people who lost their businesses during BLM riots? What about the dude who got his skull cracked because some activist told him all cops are fascists? Should we hold those journalists responsible?" Jackson shook his head. "That's not the same thing." "Why not?" Rogan pressed. "Because one is punching up and the other is punching down," Jackson said, exasperated. You guys act like both sides are the same, but they're not. Marginalized groups have historically been oppressed by people in power. When they fight back, it's not the same as when privileged people punch down. Tucker leaned in, eyes gleaming. Ah, there it is. You don't actually believe in objective morality. You believe that who says something determines whether it's good or bad. When your side spreads hate, you call it justice. When our side disagrees, you call it violence. Jackson sighed. No, I'm saying context matters. If you're part of an oppressed group, you can't oppress the people in power. It's not the same. Rogan tilted his head. Wait, so let me get this straight. If a white guy insults a black guy, that's racism. But if a black guy insults a white guy, that's, what, justice? It's different, Jackson insisted. Carlson laughed. This is exactly why your movement is losing steam, Jackson. Regular people hear that nonsense and think, wait a minute, that's just an excuse to be hypocritical. Jackson's frustration was growing. He could feel the debate slipping out of his control. You guys love to act like the victim. But let's not forget, you have the power. You have the platforms, the money, the influence. Joe, your podcast reaches millions. Tucker, you are the most watched cable host in the country. Don't sit here and pretend you're the underdogs. Rogan smirked. I'm not saying we're victims, dude. I'm saying the solution to bad speech is more speech, not censorship. You fight bad ideas with better ideas, not by shutting people up. Jackson's voice was rising now. And what happens when the bad ideas lead to real harm? Should the government step in then? Carlson's expression turned ice-cold. Oh, so now you want the government controlling speech. Thanks for confirming what we already knew. The audience exploded again, some in cheers, some in groans. Jackson gritted his teeth. That's not what I said. Rogan raised his hands. Well, then let's get specific. Give me one clear example where harmful speech should be punished. Jackson was ready. Okay. Holocaust denial. Rogan nodded. I think Holocaust denial is idiotic and disgusting. But banning it doesn't make it go away. In fact, it makes conspiracy theorists more convinced they're right. When you suppress speech, you don't defeat bad ideas. You push them underground, where they fester and grow. Carlson jumped in. Not to mention, if you start banning that, where does it stop? Who decides what's too dangerous? You. The government. Tech companies. Jackson exhaled sharply. So your answer is to just let everything be allowed? Rogan shrugged. Pretty much, yeah. Let dumb ideas get exposed. Let people debate. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Jackson shook his head. That's just libertarian nonsense. Carlson smirked. No, it's called freedom. And that's why we're winning this debate. Jackson's fists clenched under the table. He wasn't done yet. But neither were they. Jackson Hayes felt the walls closing in. He had spent years in media circles where his rhetoric was unchallenged, where his arguments were treated as absolute truths. But here, under the scrutiny of Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan, those arguments were falling apart. He needed to shift the debate. You love talking about free speech, but let's be real, Jackson said, his voice sharp. When people like you spread hate, it leads to real harm. Look at the Buffalo shooter, inspired by Great Replacement conspiracy theories. Look at January 6th. Speech isn't harmless. Carlson leaned forward, smirking. Oh, so now we're blaming ideas instead of individuals? If speech causes violence, then Bernie Sanders should be blamed for the guy who shot up a Republican baseball game. AOC should be responsible for the guy who tried to kill Kavanaugh. Jackson's eyes narrowed. That's not the same. Joe Rogan tilted his head. Why not? Because it's your side. A murmur rippled through the audience. Jackson's frustration deepened. This is what you do. You twist things to avoid accountability. Carlson grinned. You mean we hold both sides accountable? Jackson's voice tightened. Fine. Let's talk about trans rights. Your side spreads fear about kids being brainwashed, about women's sports being under attack. That rhetoric gets trans people killed. Carlson's expression darkened. So questioning policies is now violence? You're saying parents can't even have concerns without being labeled bigots? Jackson exhaled sharply. They can have concerns, but when you push those narratives, it fuels hysteria. Rogan leaned in, arms crossed. So, if people are concerned about something, we should just shut them up? Jackson clenched his fists. No, but... Carlson pounced. That's exactly what you want. You don't debate. You censor. You don't trust people to think for themselves, so you want to control what they hear. The audience shifted. Some of Jackson's supporters were silent now, uncertain. Jackson pointed at Carlson. You act like a free speech warrior, but let's not forget, you were fired from Fox News for lying. Gasps rippled through the auditorium. A low, satisfied murmur rose from Jackson's supporters. Carlson chuckled. Oh, that's cute. You mean how I was fired, with a multi-million-dollar payout? Jackson, buddy, if that's what getting fired looks like, sign me up for unemployment. Laughter from the conservative side of the crowd. Jackson pushed forward. Fox had to pay nearly $1 billion because of the lies they let you spread about the 2020 election. Carlson smirked. You mean the same network that also cut a check to your side for falsely smearing a high school kid in a MAGA hat? Spare me the moral outrage. Jackson bristled. That's a false equivalency. Rogan chuckled. That's what you say whenever we expose your double standards. Jackson could feel it now. He was losing. He could see the doubt creeping into the faces of his own supporters. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a voice rang out. He's right. Jackson turned his head sharply. A young woman stood. I came here supporting Jackson. But watching this, I'm realizing, they're making better points. You do sound like you just want to control speech. Scattered gasps. Whispers spread like wildfire. Jackson's throat went dry. That's not what I... Another voice chimed in. You say speech causes harm, but you never explain why your side's speech doesn't count. Why is it okay when the left spreads hate toward conservatives, white people, men? More murmurs. A few people clapped. Jackson's face burned red. Joe Rogan crossed his arms, grinning. And that is why we let people talk. Carlson leaned back, shaking his head. Looks like free speech won tonight. The moderator cleared his throat, looking rattled. I think this is a good place to pause. But the debate was already over. And Jackson Hayes had lost. Jackson Hayes sat frozen. The debate was over, but the sting of defeat lingered. The murmurs in the crowd had shifted, from enthusiastic support at the beginning to quiet doubt. Some of his own followers had turned on him, questioning whether he was really standing for free thought or just pushing ideological control. The moderator cleared his throat. Thank you all for this engaging discussion. I'd like to give each of you a final statement before we conclude. Mr. Hayes, you may begin. Jackson swallowed, gripping the edges of the table. He had one last chance to salvage this. I still stand by what I said, he declared, forcing confidence into his voice. This isn't just about free speech, it's about responsibility. You, he gestured toward Carlson and Rogan, use your platforms to push dangerous ideas, and then act like you're innocent when real harm happens. That's not bravery. That's cowardice. Some applause, but it was weaker than before. Carlson smirked. Thanks, Jackson. That was a great closing argument against free speech. Laughter rippled through the audience. The moderator turned to Joe Rogan. Mr. Rogan, your final thoughts? Rogan leaned into the mic. Yeah. Here's the thing, if your ideas are good, they'll win. If they're bad, they won't. But the second you start saying, some ideas are too dangerous to be heard, you aren't protecting people, you're controlling them. And history shows that never ends well. Loud applause. The moderator turned to Carlson. Mr. Carlson. Tucker smiled. Jackson, I hope you're paying attention, because what happened here tonight is free speech in action. We argued, the audience listened, and some of them changed their minds. Not because we forced them to, not because we silenced you, but because the better argument won. The audience erupted. Jackson's stomach twisted. The debate ended, and as Carson and Rogan shook hands with the moderator, Jackson quickly gathered his papers. He needed to get out. But just as he stood up, the young woman who had called him out earlier approached. "Hey, Jackson," she said. "I actually used to really respect your work. But tonight, you didn't debate. You tried to control the debate. That's not what free speech is about." Jackson clenched his jaw. "You don't get it." She shook her head. "No, you don't." As she walked away, Jackson felt something new. Not just frustration, fear. Because for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong.